So I started a new drawing because I want to take you through some things that are going to be a little bit more practical, but I want to show you a practical use for some of the stuff we just did. And what I'm going to do is going to take you through how to start the maze project. This is an exercise that I like to use in drawing one. Just to get people to have a better understanding of how they can play around with perspective and have it be fun and creative and still mechanically sound. So I'm going to draw a nice big box, and then I'll show you how to. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm building a nice big volume. And the maze is about like basically having a block and then carving into it. And if you want to plot where certain things are, we can use some of the techniques that I just showed you. But I'm just trying to make sure that my angles make sense right now. Because once we get the big limits drawn, then when we go from there, everything we do is going to follow what we've got. So it needs to be right. Okay. So if we have now, it's really important that your eye level be high for this. If you have your eye level like here, the top of the maze isn't going to have anything. It's going to be so small you won't really be able to see. So I like to make my maze kind of tall and have a nice big opening. And this is pretty random. But now I'm just going to go from here. I'm going to create some pathways through the maze. And I'm just going to the same vanishing point for everything over here. So while my former self struggles to figure out what he wants to do with the rest of this drawing, I'm going to give you guys a play-by-play and just talk a little bit about the maze project. Now, the big idea behind the maze is that it integrates the mechanics of perspective with the opportunity to have some fun and be a little bit more creative, because I totally understand that perspective drawing can be really dry and it's not always the most exciting mode of communication, let's say. So it takes me a little while in this drawing before I start to have some ideas that are kind of interesting. But in the meantime, the mechanics that in the ellipses / planes video, I made an effort to make sure that I used every single one of those things in the maze. But so when those come up, I'll point them out. But the idea behind the maze is that we construct this block and then we just we carve passageways into it. And I start doing that right away. And remember, all the lines inside the box go to the 2 vanishing points. That's really all you have to worry about. In a minute or two, I take the passageways through the maze, and I do something that is not following those vanishing points, and I want to explain it when it happens. So I might interrupt myself when we get there. It's coming up pretty soon. But you can notice the way I'm drawing. I'm taking a lot of time and a lot of effort to make sure that those lines are going to the vanishing points. I always draw them all the way out. Okay, so here comes the part where I don't use the same vanishing points. If you've ever been to New York City, or if you've ever looked at a map of New York City is laid out on a grid, right? All the roads, streets in Manhattan are north and south. There might be more than one, but the one that I'm really familiar with is called, the one that isn't north-south and east-west, it's called Broadway. So what I'm doing here, I refer to as Broadway, where if you're walking through Manhattan and you're trying to find your way around and you're counting the streets, you get to this weird street called Broadway that goes through the city at an angle. And if you're trying to navigate your way through the streets, it throws a monkey wrench in what you're doing, and it makes it so easy to get lost. And that's what I did here. I just chose a random corner and I drew a line to the other corner, and then I decided how wide that street was going to be, and I just made that line and the width of the passageway, I made it converge on the horizon. So that's what you're seeing. And this is where I start. As soon as what I just did there is I took that original street that's going off to the right. I needed to find where the bottom of that opening stops. So I went over to the right, over to the left. I carried that hallway over to the left. I went down, and then I carried it on the bottom so I could see where it hits the bottom all the way over to the vanishing point. When I lined those up, I get that passageway. And a big part of the maze is carrying out the logic that you've established. And this part in the back where that line goes down, it still looks a little low to me. I don't see if there's a mistake there. I'm having a hard time seeing it, but you guys can see that diagonal opening that kind of goes up and back in space. And that's the whole idea. And so here I'm creating increments, finding the halfway point, and letting that go back to the vanishing point. Go from the corner to the half, down to the bottom, create a new increment. And at this moment, I don't even know what's going to happen here, but I'm in sort of a creative mode. So I'm just drawing and just letting things develop. And when it comes to the maze, we start out with this big volume, but one of the things I wanted to play around with is the idea that you're not limited to just that volume. You can go up, you can go down, you can go back in space, or you can go into the block. And so I made an effort to make sure that I build on it. And a little bit later, I build a staircase that goes down into the ground. But this is just a tower. And so the first thing I did was I raised that front corner of the tower. I raised it up as high as I wanted to go. And then I immediately went from that front corner to the vanishing point on the right. And then I established some more limits. And then I got that vanishing point on the left. Now I'm doing the top. And I do something kind of goofy with the top of it later that you guys can laugh at me for. the thing I do later doesn't work quite as well as it should because it's not a square up there. But anyway, it's something that we'll be talking about. I don't necessarily have things to say about everything that's going on here, so I'm just going to make fun of how wobbly my lines are there and how much I'm struggling. Um, I'm drawing for a really long time, and there are elements of drawing just when you get comfortable that get easier, but some of the basic mechanics, you get faster at it, but um, it doesn't mean you're not going to struggle at times. And I'm putting forth all my effort here um, without a specific plan. So here, and this is something that I didn't show you in the previous video, but this is going to be a vertical ellipse because I have an idea about just building like a little arch. So I'm finding the center of that plane, and then I'm doubling it going down so that I can make a square. And it's not really a square in space, but it's close. And really, I just want to make the ellipse on the top half. But the mechanics of this idea that I'm doing here are really important. Because one of the things I'm going to have you guys do later is draw, well, machines. And you may not be able to do that if you don't really have machines at your house. I have in the studio a whole bunch of different machines that are perfect for this kind of thing. But what I'm doing now is I took the structure that I built on the left with the ellipse vertically, and I'm just taking the build, the box of it, and I'm moving it to the right along the vanishing point, and I'm building another plane on the right so I can put an ellipse in there. And I'm trying to keep the clarity of the box as good as I can so you guys can see it. And that's what gets hard about this. As the drawing progresses, there's so many lines. But this goes pretty well, so you can kind of see it. And once I get that in, then I'll clarify the edge work. And that curve needs to come out a little more. Me in the past sees it just as easily as me in the present. All right. So I start thinking about that block in the front, whereas right now it kind of looks like a washing machine. I kind of start thinking about it like it maybe is a face, and eventually I draw a little face that goes in there. But what I'm doing now is I'm thinking about a stairwell going down into the ground. So this is where you can just take the lines that you already have in the maze and you can pull them forward. If the original lines for the maze are right, you can go in any direction. You can even go down. But this one goes out into the space out in front. So I'm just taking my time and making sure that I'm following our vanishing points. And I exaggerate a little bit. I don't know that I got that totally right. But now I'm just thinking about the difference between the risers in the stairwell and the landings. So there was a riser going down, there's a landing going where you step, another riser, and I just do that all the way down. And then erase some things and clarify it. But the stuff that we're doing here, it's all about being consistent. Make sure you know where your vanishing points are. And, I still, even at this late in the drawing, I still draw all my lines out because I need to be able to see the big relationships. And once you get going, you don't really need to draw them all the way out anymore because you have so many lines. Just stay between them, and you don't really have a lot to worry about. So you can see my little staircase. Maybe that's a stairway down to like the subway system or something. Let's see, I don't remember what I do next. Maybe I make a door. No. Clarifying some of the big information there now that I've got a clearer picture of what's going to happen. All right, so I build a door here because it doesn't make sense. That would be like something out of a Three Stooges episode to have um, a stairwell leading into a wall. And a lot of you guys are probably too young for the Three Stooges, but anyway, it's an ancient pop culture reference. Look them up on YouTube. So very simple, just 4 lines in the right place creates a space that you can understand and actually imagine yourself walking into. Okay, so the camera shut off without telling me, and I did the same thing on that bottom part as I did on the top part with that arch. I just did it in reverse, so it was cutting into the form rather than um, being on top of it. But it was the same thing, and now I decided it's really is a face. And I didn't realize that the camera was not picking up what I was doing at the bottom here, but this is like a tongue sticking out, and it has the tip of the tongue. I should have made it a fork, so it would be clear that it's like a snake or like the whole building is like a dragon that's curled up, and that's his tongue. But I do a forked thing later. It's just you wouldn't have seen it anyway, so not much point. And what I wanted to do was bring the tongue into the mouth and have the tongue curl up just like the sides of the two ellipses, that cylinder that cuts into his mouth. But I realized that it was just going to be really hard to see if I did that. So I just I stood around and thought about it for a minute, and then I just stopped. I was thinking about eyeballs for the dragon or the snake. Um, and then I get a couple of ideas and I sort of entertain them. Um, but right now I'm just tightening some things up. So here I thought that our dragon needed some nostrils because I was thinking more about his face. So I just set up a little symmetrical structure based on the quarters. Like I have the front of his face broken up into 4 equal parts going back. So I just used two, the first hash mark and the third hash mark to just mark out symmetry so that I could draw some nostrils and clarify it. And none of those lines are using any of the vanishing points, but you could still see them as little cutout angles and chips into the basic building here. So here I must be standing there scratching my chin thinking. And I've got some pretty good ideas coming up, so uh, maybe I should have fast forwarded through this part. Hey, I'm back. Okay, so forgive me on this part. Um, this gets a little weird. But I can show you how to do this in a different video where it works out a little bit better. I kind of confused myself. I thought that this would work really well with a rectangle, volume, it kind of needs to be a square for it to really play out. But there's a building in London that has this sort of a twist between the top plane and the secondary plane a little bit further down. And if we just give it a minute to play out, I'm trying to find that back place. So yeah, so I can get that angle right. And when I erase it, it'll make a little bit more sense. So I'm just connecting a side plane to the front plane. And then every time I have one plane, I'm connecting it to the one that's clockwise to the right. And it's very weird. But you can start to see kind of a twist in those planes. Kind of a cool idea. But there's a book that I'm going to base some of my future videos on about some of the potentiality of what can happen with boxes. And it's a very systematic approach to thinking about volume. It's actually an architecture book that I use to think about drawing. And we get some other things that are based on that same idea coming up here. Now, if I wanted this to look like wings or some part of the dragon, I probably should have centered this part. I didn't. I just randomly grabbed a place where there was a tower, going to be a tower coming up, and so I'm trying to figure out how I want to proceed here. So I'm using I found the top of the box or the front of the box, and then I made those angles, and I'm going to use the angles where I used to find halfway. I used those to fork the tower off into two directions. And the lines you're seeing me do now, those lines don't go to a vanishing point on the horizon. They do, because they go up at angles, they converge. And I'm kind of struggling a little bit on that left-hand side because those two lines that go from the top left to the bottom right, they actually converge going away from us down to the right, whereas the one on the right converges going up away from us. And that confused me for a second, but I got it. And then, and the idea that you have lines that converge onto a vanishing point that isn't on the horizon, that applies to any set of parallel lines that isn't uh, based on the ground plane. If it's flat onto the ground and it's moving back in space, it'll go to the horizon. If it's tilted at all, it won't. And that's what's happening with these. That's why I wanted to throw that in there. A good way to practice that is to have draw boxes that have get like moving boxes or cardboard boxes and have the flaps open. And parts of the flaps will correspond to your vanishing points and your horizon, but then one of the other set of angles will not. That's a good way to practice that. So this is pretty well developed. And I believe there's one more thing that I do. And it gets kind of elaborate, so I slow down. I go back to normal speed so you guys can try and follow it. And I'll wait until we start that. I guess I should have sped through this part up too. I apologize for the length of these videos. I actually did my best to keep them as short as possible. But there's just so much material when it comes to perspective drawing. And there's so many cool things that I want to show you guys. Um, It just takes time. All right, so here I get the idea that uh, the 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 dragon needs some scales, and I've been thinking about this the whole time making the drawing, and so you can see I built that plane to make that part of his neck or his shoulder a little bit wider. And find the middle, and then break it into quarters, and you'll see what I'm up to in a second. But I need triangles because that's how I want to do my scales are going to be triangles. So that's the front of the first scale. And then the same thing, that's the front of the second one. And I'm going to do 2 rows of scales going back to the left. And it's all just based on information that came from finding the center of a plane. So I'm just building on what's already there. And it's just a matter of just taking the time to think about what you think might be possible. And perspective can lead you into all sorts of really cool places. So you can see I'm building these little 3-dimensional triangles coming off the side. And the further back, the first set is actually pretty easy to do. The next set behind them that I'm going to build, it gets really hard to see. And I make a mistake, and I did not see it while I was drawing. I've watched this back 3 or 4 times, and it took me that long to pick it up. But it still looks cool, and it's still consistent with the perspective of the rest of the objects. So here I'm thinking about the next row, and I want them to alternate. So there's going to be 3 triangles. So I'm pushing the middle back so I can make sure that I know where the next increment's going to be, and I just line things up. And that last line was my mistake, but it turns out not to matter. And this gets really weird and confusing looking. But once I get to the end and I erase out some of the basic planes, you'll be able to see with some clarity. And I could have kept going, but it was just about lunchtime. So, and I had been working on this drawing for quite a while, and I was ready for a break. But a lot of what we're doing in the maze is just about thinking visually, like thinking out loud. And if you have an idea, just try to make it work. I mean, that's what I'm doing here. I'm showing you guys I'm struggling here to make this work, and I'm going very slowly, and I'm just trying to think my way through the problem. And that's, in my mind, that's kind of what perspective drawing is about. It's not just about making sure that your angles are right. Um, it's about using perspective to realize some of the ideas that you have kicking around your head and to see the potential in a structure that is so simple. Like, that's one of the wonderful things about perspective, is it's such a simple idea, but it took it took people like literally like 40, 50,000 years to figure it out. If you go back to the Romans, they're pretty recent and they have some pretty good drawing, but perspective is not something they figured out. They get really close if you look at some of their drawing, um, but they always mess it up. They have perfect perspective in their architecture, but in drawing they didn't see it. It's a really hard thing to pick up on, but there's a there's a real clarity that you can arrive at when you finally figure it out and you can make it work. So one of my plans is to make a video where I go over this kind of thinking in some more detail, because it's I don't know that it's advanced. In my mind, it's actually um, based on really, really simple principles. So in my mind, it's something that a beginner ought to be able to handle. Um, but if I go and do that and it just ends up being too complicated, maybe we'll try and find ways to simplify it. But it would be a lot easier to deal with in a regular class rather than an online one. So if you're watching this as part of the online class, it's who knows if we'll get to it. All right, so after this, I believe I just go through and I erase some things just to make sure that the information gets clarified. Yeah, here I'm darkening them in because there's a lot of lines that I don't need anymore. And if I wanted to continue this back in space, I ran out of time. If I wanted to continue this back now that I have a template for both um, different ways that the pattern goes, I could just go back to the left with no real problem at all. And this would look really cool if it was on like a big long plane with just filled up by these scales. That would have been really neat. So I hope that what we did here gives you guys an idea of what needs to happen in the context of making a maze. So just start with that big volume, build it, and stay consistent.